Hello, everyone. Welcome. Feel free to keep introducing yourselves in the thread as we go ahead and get started. But yeah, welcome to our webinar, Defend People's Struggle, Unmasking Trump's Cabinet Cronies, hosted by the International League of People's Struggle here in the US. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate everyone taking the time to be here together. 50 days into the Trump administration, it's more important than ever that we're coming together, developing a shared understanding of the political situation, and most importantly, learning about how to fight back together. So yeah, welcome. My name is Daniel. I'm a member of the steering committee of ILPS US. I'll be helping to introduce today's webinar and then passing it off to a couple of wonderful speakers that will be leading us through some discussion and education today. The International League of People's Struggle, for those not familiar, is an anti-imperialist alliance around the world, hundreds of different organizations fighting against a common enemy, imperialism. Within the US, we are taking a stand against Trump and all of his attacks on the people. And beyond that, all of what Trump represents, imperialism and fascism. So for today, we're going to be unpacking that a little bit. Folks are, of course, familiar with the political situation generally. We don't need to go too much in depth in all of the different ways that the people are under attack at the moment. But we do need to clarify the different fronts on which people are struggling and the different issues that people are facing. Of course, this webinar was put together to consolidate and really wage a struggle against Trump 50 days into his administration, 50 days into his renewed attacks on the people in now his second term. These issues, these attacks are really critical. We have to be able to fight back and defend our communities. But we know that it's not just the flurry of executive orders that we need to be opposing right now. We know that Trump has long-term plans. He is installing a cabinet of some of the worst people in the world, hand-selected to carry out his agenda and the agenda of the ruling class. And so today's webinar hopes to break that down a little bit. How is Trump building out the infrastructure to terrorize the people beyond just this week, this month, or even this year, but really reshaping and restructuring the political and economic system to further intensify this crisis and to terrorize the people. His cabinet is just one of the many ways that we can understand the impacts, but also the interests behind Trump's agenda. And while we have to recognize all of the different impacts on the people, we're not just here to despair about the state of the world. We want to know about who is causing the destruction so that we can fight back. We can connect the different issues together and build a mass movement, really, to oppose the fascism and the imperialism that is at the core of these attacks. ILPS is waging two primary campaigns at the moment. The first one, Defend Our Communities, Defend People's Struggle, is also the namesake of this webinar. It's really a fight against the attacks on the people, primarily through different law enforcement departments and programs, agencies. So when ICE is raiding our neighborhoods, when the campus cops are cracking down on our communities, we need to be there to defend our communities and defend the people's resistance to the brutality of the system. So that's the first of two campaigns that ILPS is waging at this moment. and that we would like to share with folks today. The second is the campaign People Over Profit, a fight against the attacks on the people, primarily on the economic front. How are people's day-to-day issues, whether it's at their job, their wages, their debt, but even their housing, right? Their education. How are these various issues a symptom of this system that is putting profit over people? And that is the second campaign that we wish to advance and fight through this education, but also in the coming days and months through the struggles on the ground that ILPS is helping to lead. We know that both of these campaigns have a deep basis in all of the ways that people are fighting back against the Trump administration and his cronies, and would love to share some of the different impacts with you today and hear how people are already waging the struggle against these attacks. So for today's presentation, there's a couple of different components that we'll be walking through. We'll be starting off with a view of how people in the US are being affected. What is the domestic situation that we can understand through Trump's cabinet picks and the different offices that they hold, the different roles that they are operating, the gears of fascism that they are turning. Then moving from the US to the international situation, what are the impacts of the Trump regime on the world, the people of the world at large? And then we'll cap it off with a specific focus on repression. How are people being targeted when they fight back against these different attacks through the framework of the Defend People Struggle campaign? So these are some of the different components we'll be walking through, and then we'll close it out with a discussion. So please stick around if you're available. Following some of the presentation, we'll be breaking out into different discussion groups to learn more about the different impacts in our own communities and ways that we can come together and resist all of Trump and his cronies' plans for our communities. So thank you again for being here today. If any questions are coming up or anything like that, please feel free to use the chat. For those that haven't gotten a chance to, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the thread. And if you're from a particular city or organization, we would love to hear. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to get us started with the first portion of today's presentation.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm Sarah with Anti-Imperialist Action. I'm calling in from the Baltimore DMV region. If we could actually go to our next slide. Just wanted to start off by talking about what's happening in the US right now. And we're really seeing that from day one, that Trump and his administration are already putting their agenda into motion by attacking everyday people. So even just in the month of February alone, the Department of Homeland Security reported that there were over 8,000 arrests and 5,000 deportations that occurred that have been really terrorizing migrant communities and workplaces. And even though these numbers are in the thousands, just think about like the amount of individuals, but even like families that these numbers like reflect. They're not content with what they're putting up. If you attended our last webinar, we talked about how we're in the midst of the economic crisis. So the ruling class wants to take attention away from the big business elites who are actually responsible for this crisis. So they need scapegoats, which is why we're seeing the use of fear, criminalization, of racist rhetoric to target migrants. But since they're not hitting their target numbers, we're seeing them take additional measures, like rolling back the temporary protected status, which would put over 1 million people from Venezuela and Haiti at risk of deportation. And these policies are preventing people from receiving education, from accessing healthcare, from working, just out of the fear of leaving their home and possibly never being able to see their families again. And at the hands of Doge and Elon Musk, we're seeing that thousands of federal workers are being laid off. And this is their plan to eliminate the checks and balances that regulate state power play out in real time. And so Musk's cost-cutting spree is allowing fascism to have free reign. And the impact on the people is exponential. So without personnel or funding, the departments in health and labor and education are unable to provide people with public services that actually benefit them. So working class people, people with disabilities, retirees, are unable to access social security benefits. The research programs that are being put on to improve like public health response are being eliminated. And students who rely on grant and scholarship programs are having their education access restricted. And so these moves have sparked spontaneous protests against Musk across the country. But the administration has already made steps to ensure that they have a loyal mass base of people who can support them. For example, seeing that Trump pardoned 1,500 of his loyal followers who rioted on January 6th. But while the most conservative sections of society are being granted state protection, student protesters who are calling for change and who are exposing war and imperialism are being arrested and are having their visas revoked. So we're really seeing, what it is that this administration will tolerate and the agenda that they're trying to put into place. So this is what is happening. This is the executive branch of government trying to consolidate their power. And these are the representatives of monopoly capital who want to continue to amass wealth. So I want us to focus on that phrase, monopoly capital, a little bit, if we can go to the next slide. Because we want to understand their strategy and why we're seeing these fascist attacks play out from all sides. So zooming all the way out, we know that the world is being divided up by these huge monopoly corporations. So if
What are
you
you
think
at?
about
I'm just watching
About
a webinar about Trump.
sorry, about Nestle, et cetera, that control whole industries. Each of these huge corporations are monopolies who are competing to expand to every corner of the world, to acquire more land for raw materials, to exploit people whose local economies have been devastated by these corporations, and to tap into overseas markets to sell and dump their excess products. So the US as a state, as an imperialist power, will enact policies to protect the monopoly capital of its own countries, because they want to ensure that super profit continues to be raked in order to expand production. So this drive for expansion is only intensifying the political and the economic crisis that we're experiencing domestically. And the working class, who are most acutely exploited, are facing sharp and really direct consequences. The stagnating wages, attacks on unionizing, high cost of living, stripping away like any regulatory measures that prevent people from working in substandard conditions. And we're seeing people take up a fight and struggling against this intensification, even in the face of worsening force, of reaction, of repression. But this is Trump's cabinet, state monopoly capitalism. That's responsible for the heightening crisis that's being passed on to the working class, onto the people in colonies and semi-colonies, all in order to consolidate the power of the ruling class. So I want us to understand, going into the rest of the webinar, that state monopoly capitalism brings together the power of monopoly capital and the power of the state. And that's why we're seeing the US using the full force of its state power, the law, the police, courts, prisons, to make sure that monopoly capitalism can continue to make money, to bring in those super profits, to make sure that they can expand and spread worldwide. So this is why we're seeing like multi-million-dollar like ad campaigns that are being released to criminalize migrants in order to push forward their mass deportation plans. Why we're seeing the government spend additional millions of dollars on expensive deportation flights using military equipment. And why we're seeing them go to such great lengths to equip state and federal agencies to carry out their plans, and to expand the facilities, the prisons that will house people who are being held in detention. And this is why we're seeing that Elon Musk, a billionaire who is having like unrestricted access to bureaucratic power, and anything that he deems unnecessary or inefficient, we're seeing are the programs and the services that are actively keeping people out of poverty and out of debt. So it's important for us to understand their overall goal and their strategy, not just to like more easily recognize the faces that are in Trump's cabinet, but to understand what it is that they're doing. To understand that they're trying to use the full power of the state to protect and expand monopoly capital, which they're representing and which they're a part. So I'll pass it off to the next speaker now so we can learn a little bit more about who the cabinet members are and how they're pushing this agenda within the US.
Right on. Thank you so much, Sarah. Hi there, everyone. This is Cody. I'm on the National Steering Committee for ILPS US, and I'm also on the International Coordinating Committee of ILPS here at the ILPS NorCal Watch Party. So because we're seeing across the world, all of our member organizations of ILPS are working with communities who are being impacted by this fascist and imperialist agenda of the Trump regime at the head of US imperialism. And I think that's what's so important to remember about what Sarah was just talking about, is that Trump in the White House, he's got a whole system laid out that was laid out long before him that is playing its role to exploit as much as it can from right here in the US and around the world, and to clamp down with brute force on whoever is fighting back. So this is a systematic problem, and it needs a systematic solution for all of us in the US and around the world. But to really start to understand how this agenda is being implemented, it's now important to lay out some of the faces and the names of these cronies that this crybaby wannabe dictator has set up in order to play out his agenda. So I want to just lay out first that this is what we're going to talk about is not the full range of Trump's cabinet. We've highlighted some key people here that's important to look at based on the policies that they're giving out. But really what's important to know is what the policies are, what the class interests behind this really are, and how are they impacting the people. So the first I'm going to start out with is Russell Vought, the head of the Department of Management and Budget. This guy was actually in Trump's first cabinet, and he took what he wrote, what he learned in the cabinet there, and during Biden's presidency, he started working for the Heritage Foundation, and he was actually one of the authors of Project 2025. I think folks on past ILPS US webinars have heard us talk about Project 2025, this whole 900-page pretty much playbook of policy that was written pretty much directly for the Trump cabinet to hand over to say, this is what you do to destroy the checks and balances in the federal government and give the president pretty much untrammeled power. So how do we know that Project 2025 is being implemented by the Trump regime? It's because it's the clearest, one of the clearest ways is one of the authors is actually in the position where he's carrying this out. And what is he doing to carry this out? He is just dismantling so much of the federal budget. He's pretty much Elon Musk's right-hand man in the executive branch, carrying out the DOGE decrees, doing mass layoffs of government workers, cutting budgets left and right that is destroying public institutions. This guy took bribes from wealthy conservative donors. We know that because there was journalists who pretended to be wealthy conservative donors and met with him and video recorded him saying that he was planning to do all of this, along with all the guys that were going to be brought into Trump's cabinet. He's an avowed Christian nationalist, and he openly uses those values in his role by cutting specific things like access to abortion, to hospitals states that allow abortion. You know, he's carrying out the Christian nationalist agenda by cutting funding to the states that don't carry his values. And he can do that because he has the power to do it. in the Department of Management and Budget. Remember, this is an issue of the people who are in power and how they are using that to carry out this agenda. If you jump to the next slide, also talking about issues of budget, we got to talk about the Department of the Treasury. So here's Scott Bessent, the new head of the Treasury. This guy is right at the forefront defending and helping advance Trump's tariff wars that are threatening the economic stability of the whole world, that are raising inflation here and there, that are skyrocketing prices, that are hurting workers, hurting farmers, hurting small businesses. The only people that it's benefiting are the people at the top of the policy and Trump himself, who are winning all these concessions from Canada, from Mexico, in order that are being threatened with these tariffs unless they bow to the Trump, whatever Trump says. He also held a meeting. One of his first meetings with one of his counterparts is with the fanatical fascist finance minister of the Zionist entity of Smotrich, who is talking about closer connections between the US and the fascist Zionist state of Israel and more economic connections there. How else is this affecting people domestically? He's tearing apart social safety nets for working families. Inflation is starting to skyrocket. The economy is showing a lot of signs that it's about to take a major dip. And he's saying it's okay. This is a quote unquote detox period. It is a detox period for working people who he is claiming have been like parasites living off of public welfare spending. That's what the Trump cabinet thinks of working people. They think they're like drug users and the drug is government spending. And so an economic crisis is a detox period. This is literally what they think, and they're openly saying it. And he's also said we need to quote unquote move away from public spending to private spending, again, showing who's being directly benefited by these policies. It's the private corporate sector. If you jump to the next slide, the next person that we're going to talk about here is Scott Turner, head of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Scott Turner, just like many of the cabinet picks that Trump is picking, actually have very little political background. This guy's a former NFL football player. Trump is an entertainment mogul. He sees politics just like entertainment. And you'll see with Scott Turner, as well as some of his other cabinet picks, that he picks people from sports and entertainment for his cabinet just because, you know, again, he's picking the guys that he's closest with. This guy is systematically gutting affordable public housing projects because, again, he's in charge of housing and as well as development in urban centers where there's a massive houselessness crisis. And so what's he doing? He's cutting $3.6 billion from houseless relief programs. He's already done this and he's threatening to do more. He is carrying out the Project 2025's call to end, quote unquote, housing first policies, and moving instead towards sobriety mandated policies and even religious based ones. Now, I want to clarify what this means. Housing first policies are policies that are meant to aid homeless folks by saying, if you're homeless, probably the first thing you need is a home, right? So give people housing and then put them into programs where they can go through sobriety and they can get jobs and whatnot. Well, this guy is saying, no, we need to make sure they can prove that they can be sober. They can prove that they can keep up a job. And they somehow need to do all of this without having a home, without living in a house. They are putting houseless folks through the toughest situation ever because these programs are for profit. Again, who is benefiting from this and who is being left out in the dirt when this happens? It's always the working class that is being thrown out, especially in this cabinet of Trump. If you jump to the next slide, we'll now go on to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., head of the Department of Health and Human Services. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has never done anything with health. He's done very little with human services. He's had almost no experience in health. He's just a political dynasty pick for Trump. He's from a well-known Democrat dynasty, the Kennedys, and somehow he seems, because he's the black sheep of the family, Trump gets to have a Kennedy in his cabinet, and it makes him look like he's good, like with the Democrats. That's not happening at all. This is just another big show pick. He's an infamous vaccine skeptic. He's a racist conspiracy theorist who believes that COVID-19 was invented by Chinese people and Jews. He has literally said that on public TV. And he most recently downplayed the recent Texas measles outbreak that would just happen, saying that people don't need the vaccines. But actually, he did reverse his position, but only after there was mass organized outrage against him. And that's what we need. The only thing to get anything out of this cabinet is mass organized outrage. You jump to the next slide. We will get to Lori Chavez de Remer, the Department of Labor head. Now, she could be the wild card. Lori was a senator, a state Congress legislator in Oregon. She was also the mayor of Happy Valley within Oregon, where she supported the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. Now, I lived in Oregon for about 10 years, and I know for a fact that Oregonians fought tooth and nail to fight for the PRO Act and for the right to organize in the state. So I'd like to believe that she bowed to pressure when there was enough fight that was put against that, and that's why she put this in here. I would even more like to believe that she truly believes that workers should have the right to organize. But I'm scared because in her recent confirmation hearing, she seemed to walk back that support a bit. So I think we need to, in order to see what she will, in order to see that if she'll continue to push for those same things she pushed for as an Oregon legislator, or if she'll bow down to Project 2025, which I have right here in front of me, and it specifically says about the Department of Labor, just that the only thing that it needs to do is to, quote unquote, reclaim the role of the American worker as the protagonist of his or her own life and restore the family as the centerpiece of American life. The pro-life is all about the collective right to organize. This is all about workers being isolated from each other and just making more children for more workers for the ruling class. So I think that if we're going to get something out of her, just like that we did when she was a legislator in Oregon, we're going to have to fight again tooth and nail to make sure she listens to the people and not the Trump regime. Jump to the next slide. We're going to go now to Linda McMahon. I hope I pronounced that right. Another big entertainment pick. She's the head of the Department of Education, but she's also the wife of one of Trump's best friends who owns the WWE entertainment empire, who Trump famously, I remember, would be on all the time, even wrestling on camera. And actually, there was many times where there was a video clip of Trump wrestling someone on this TV. And later, when his opposition in his last term was coming out against him, he would just release videos, like memes, and put the face of his political opposition on it. That's what he thinks. He thinks this is a fight. This is like literally putting out violent videos against his political opposition. So he did another big friend pick by picking Linda McMahon here, who now plans to strip federal funding for school districts that are teaching progressive values, this so-called war on woke, to get rid of funding for schools that are teaching pro-people values, that are teaching anti-racism, teaching actual people's history. She's changing the national curriculum to match the Christian and white nationalist narrative. She's supporting Trump's plan to arrest and deport student activists, just like Mahmoud Khalil, who was arrested at Columbia, and there are people taken to the streets all these past days, including today, to demand his release. She's right there at the forefront of this campaign to arrest and deport students on these campuses. And we have seen that Project 2025 has actually called for the dissolution of the Department of Education in general, so that the local strongmen in the different states can start to transform education into this conservative and anti-people narrative in the past. Let's see if she'll decide to do it this time. Jump to the next slide now. We have just a few more to go through. Pam Bondi, the head of the Department of Justice. Once again, another Trump crony pick. Again, Trump is picking his cabinets just like a mafia godfather picks his upper echelon of his organized crime empire. He's picking his loyalists, the people who have worked with him. Pam Bondi was Trump's personal defense lawyer during his first impeachment trial. She also was part of a think tank, the America First Policy Institute, that pushed for corporate law reform. And she was a lobbyist, a foreign lobbyist for a Persian Gulf development company. Now, what does that tell us about Pam Bondi? She knows a lot about the loopholes in the law for corporations to get away from regulations. Well, now she's she's a part of the highest law in the land, and she can actually put those corporate dodging laws into law, into legal reality. This will destroy any kind of semblance of workers' power. She upheld Florida's abortion ban and holds the power to ban abortion nationwide should she choose. And she's bringing back, quote unquote, tough on crime law that is directing federal prosecutors to prioritize the harshest sentences for arrestees. Next slide, please. So again, these are the cronies that we have to fight back against and the policies that are harming the people. Kash Patel, the director of the FBI that is under Pam Bondi that we just looked at. Kash Patel is also another Trump loyalist. He's on the board of Truth Social, Trump's social media company. And he wrote a children's book where Trump is king. So again, showing you that it's the people who are the biggest bootlickers of Trump that he is bringing up, not the people who are actually that are actually good at what they do. But he's also very good at what Trump wants him to do, which is to use the power of the FBI to crack down on activists, go after the media who are just trying to tell the truth if they're media that is not spinning the narrative in the way that Trump wants. He's promised to legally absolve the January 6th rioters, calling them quote unquote political prisoners. And he's dismissed warnings of rising neo-Nazi and white nationalist movements saying, oh, don't worry about it, they're not actually coming. But we have to go after Antifa, after Black Lives Matter, after pro-Palestine activists. That's what the FBI is looking at coming forward. Jump to the next slide. Two more people before I'll pass it on. We now come to the Director of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem. At the head, one of the people at the head of Trump's mass deportation, fascist crackdown against migrants here in the US. She is reviving war on drugs rhetoric to fuel the mass deportation campaign. I'll even jump to the last quote that's on here, the last thing on this page, by parroting Trump's and Defense Secretary Hegseth's threats to invade Mexico, saying that Mexico is working with the Chinese government somehow to bring fentanyl in through Mexico and into the US. And so therefore going after migrants will help stem the fentanyl crisis. This is a completely racist narrative. It is here not even just to go after migrants, it's to help to build up to more war with Mexico, even a world war with China. That's what she is spearheading out there in the mass media. She's targeting specifically indigenous communities across the US. I learned she's actually banned by 7 different indigenous tribes from coming onto their reservations because of how much she was pointing falsely at indigenous communities being behind the fentanyl crisis. She is pledged to viciously prosecute any leaks from within the department, because I think even just maybe a few days ago, there were huge leaks about the nightmarish things that are happening to migrants during this mass deportation campaign. Did she apologize for this? Did she try to, get a better look in the media? No, she said, we're going to go after anyone who leaks these things coming out. So she's at the head of a Homeland Security department that is fearless in carrying out these fascist attacks on migrants. We, as an organized mass movement, need to give them something to fear. Next slide. So who is helping Kristi Noem really carry out this mass deportation campaign? It's Tom Homan, the so-called border czar is literally his title. He's the mastermind behind Trump's first-term family separation policy. He had literally said that deliberately gone after families, asking ICE to target them, to tear them apart because they give them maximum pain in order to try to dissuade migrants from trying to come back in. He said he's quote unquote not satisfied with how many people have been deported or detained so far. He's calling for even more. These are migrants who are being flown home in chains to countries that they weren't even from, the countries they may not have even been to before, because they don't care where they're from. They just want them out of the US to make it seem like they are being tough on the people that they're blaming for their own economic crisis that they started. And he's even going so far as to claim that this mass deportation campaign is saving US taxpayers money. But a look at it is actually an estimating that it's costing $86 billion of US taxpayer money. Our $86 billion is going to this fascist campaign of tearing people and families out of their homes and cracking down at them on the border, sending them away to countries that, again, they may not have even been to before, and somehow we're the ones floating the bill. So this is how Trump's fascist imperialist agenda is being carried out and how it's impacting people within the US itself. If that weren't bad enough, I'm going to pass it on to see who else we can get to know and how that they are impacting people overseas.
Hey, thanks Sarah and Cody for taking us through, the strategy being implemented by Trump's cabinet picks and how that impacts people here in the US. I'm Jasper, and I'm going to take us through the international situation. So we really see this trend that Trump's executive orders, all of the cabinet picks, his recent statements all expose the strategy of US imperialism. And, now we can take a look at how this impacts other nations, right? On behalf of the world's, or the most powerful US corporations, right? The strategy is to secure the flow of profit and put nations in inescapable debt, funnel all of this money out through investments to the US, extract these countries' natural resources, exploit their cheap labor, and ensure that these nations are aligned with the whole US economic strategy, and even loop them into military alliances so that we can build up to the ultimate fight for US dominance. And what we see with the Trump administration is that, Trump and all of these cabinet cronies are just stripping away the facade that the Biden administration had, right? Now they are being openly proud and just open that US imperialism should dominate, that the profits of American companies should be secured at all costs at the expense of the people of the world. This trend is that US imperialism wants to secure its domination against the strengthening economic, political, and military power of countries like China, Russia, and Iran, and also against the advance of struggles for liberation in the semi-colonies that the US is currently controlling, using the full military might of the US if needed. So these cabinet picks that we just walked through and we're going to take a deeper dive into, that Trump selected are usually called China hawks because of their advocating and now implementing of force, warmongering and economic attacks against US imperialism's what they call their number one strategic threat. So we can go to the next slide. So one of the biggest hawks is Secretary of State Marco Rubio. So one of the first actions that Trump took was doing a 90-day freeze on foreign aid. And Rubio was really quick to put exemptions on this military aid that gave key US proxies and allies, meaning billions of dollars in military funding to the militaries of Israel, Egypt, Taiwan, and the Philippines, ensuring that that military funding to all of these is continuing to flow. So he said that foreign aid must align with what's called America First priorities, and that, quote, every dollar that we spend, every program that we fund must be justified with the answer to, does it make America more safer, stronger, and more prosperous? Meaning that they're actively backing brutal dictatorships and genocidal regimes and as their fascist puppets in the region, right? And close allies that can maintain US imperialism's interest. And this is, a huge priority for the US. Marco Rubio is also strengthening US economic and military domination in Latin America in response to growing investment from China, intensifying the violation of sovereignty of these nations. So he is supporting has openly supported the largest investment firm and asset manager, which has over $11.5 trillion in assets under their management. You know them, you hate them, BlackRock, to purchase a 90% share in the Panama Ports Company, which owns and operates the ports on each side of the Panama Canal, giving a US company control over the port of Panama. So, you might remember BlackRock from being the same company that has a huge stake in your healthcare company, your school, your workplace, and they're juicing out as much profit as possible while making the quality even worse and worse. So, control of these trade routes and supply chains is super essential for the US finance giants to ensure that their investments and products keep flowing. But, this is a direct violation of the sovereignty of the peoples of Latin America. And so, for decades, they have resisted US plunder and militarism in their homelands, and they will continue to fight. Yet another way that we see that US's foreign policy, being executed by the State Department is violating the basic rights of people to their own land and lives is in Palestine. So you all probably saw, or hopefully didn't see, that horrible AI video of Trump Gaza, where Trump brands himself as this like golden savior of Gaza by turning the land of Palestinian people into an investment sanctuary for real estate developers. It's just sickening. Like, Trump is openly advocating for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, the forcing of 2 million Palestinians off their ancestral land. And it's no surprise that the Trump Organization and Jared Kushner's private equity firm would be the ones raking in profits from this nightmare, right? Opening up more of the Middle East to investment from US capital. But, as they have for the last 76 years and will continue to until total liberation, the Palestinian people reject this plan and commit to staying on their land and will continue to fight against all Zionism and all imperialism. So even Palestinians who have been forced to migrate from their homeland due to decades of occupation and genocide are now facing attacks from the US state for standing up and fighting back for the liberation of their homeland, using the full repressive power of all US agencies. So Marco Rubio has said, I think he put this on Twitter, we will be revoking the visas and or green cards of Hamas supporters in America so that they can be deported. And 2 days ago, we just saw the impact of this, right? As Cody already mentioned, Columbia student Mahmoud Khalil was instrumental in the movement at Columbia, right? Demanding for divestment, pushing to end Columbia's role in the occupation of Palestine. And he has been arrested by the Department of Homeland Security and was told that his green card was revoked by the State Department, exactly as Marco Rubio and Trump have been pushing. So this is political repression, pure and simple, targeting those who resist. And this is why, we are calling to defend people's struggle. We can move on to the next slide. So now pushing the America First agenda in the field of foreign relations is Elise Stefanik. So she's the US representative to the United Nations, and she has a track record of cracking down on universities during the Palestine Solidarity encampments, and even claims credit for ousting multiple university presidents where students held these actions. And now she gets the power to vote against Palestine at the largest scale in the United Nations. So one of the strategies of the Trump administration that we're seeing is that Stefanik will be responsible for carrying out a key part of the America First agenda, right? This deprioritization of different multilateral initiatives and relationships, like the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Accords. The US has already left these under Trump. So, they're prioritizing one-way initiatives that can be directly led by the US. And we really see that even though the US system is part of this, multilateral system that has served imperialist interests for decades, the US wants something that it can even more easily control and dictate, right? So they're leaving climate deals that would put up bare minimum protections in favor of uninhibited drilling of oil and natural gas by big US oil and gas monopolies. And, we know that environmental plunder will continue for as long as our society is controlled by this corporate drive for profit. And these policies will further open the door up for this, uninhibited plunder to totally destroy our planet. So we can go to the next slide. now someone who has been, or who has, the potential to really destroy our planet is Pete Hegseth. So from the start, Pete has been pushing for a more lethal US military. And he says like one that is free from DEI and wokeness. And he has even switched from calling US soldiers to calling them war fighters, to really emphasize the role and the trajectory of the US military in engaging in active wars of aggression against the world's people, and to use the military power to fight for control of the world's territory and markets. So notably, he is pushing new budget priorities, right, that would redirect military spending from what he calls non-lethal programs, right? Literally anything that isn't just directly violent against the people of the world, and push tens and tens of billions of dollars more into weapon spending. So the ordered priorities for the Department of Defense is first and foremost using the military to bolster defense at the US-Mexico border. He's even been using military flights or military aircraft to deport migrants, right? And right along with that, they labeled combating transnational criminal organizations, which the State Department has already labeled several of these to be terrorist organizations. Additionally, one of their priorities is modernizing weapons and equipment. This includes the nuclear arsenal, combat aircraft, submarines, drones, missiles, even including an iron missile dome for the US. And then last but not least, military construction for the Indo-Pacific Command, the US military command responsible for military domination in the Asia-Pacific region. So instead of actually, prioritizing even safety of US military personnel, or even just cutting back on the $850 billion US military budget, they're trying to crank it up to $1 trillion. Pete is pouring more and more money into enforcing violence at the border and developing more lethal weapons. This is all to enforce, the role of the Department of Defense, as he claims, quote, to completely destroy, demoralize, and defeat enemies of the United States. So all of this is being done to prepare for a war with what Trump, Vance, Hegseth, and the whole US ruling class are labeling the primary enemy of the US, China. And we can really see the impact of this buildup to war on the peoples and land of nations like Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, right? This network of hundreds and hundreds of military bases that allows US troops to conduct thousands of military exercises and joint trainings, and even directs counterinsurgency operations against these people's movements for liberation, right? And this is also directly strengthening the US's support of these fascist regimes that partner with the imperialists to ensure their extraction and plunder will continue, which has devastated the economies of these nations and even forced millions to migrate in search of a livelihood for their families or for a safe haven from political repression and war. So it's just like a sick logic that now the same military aircraft that is bombing these people's homelands is being used to deport them from the United States. So we can move to the next slide. So a key player in solidifying US power over other nations is John Ratcliffe, director of the CIA. He's in the headlines now for pausing intelligence sharing with Ukraine, in line with the Trump administration's refocus of waging a proxy war with the US-NATO alliance in Russia so that they can really pivot and focus on the buildup to war against China. So he has even claimed, before he became national director of national intelligence under Trump's first administration, he claimed to be one of the prosecutors in the case against the Holy Land Five, where a humanitarian charity organization for Palestine was labeled as a terrorist organization, had their charity money seized, and 5 of their officials or employees were charged with financing terrorism. So he is very openly proud of this. And he clearly intends to continue and intensify the use of intelligence against political opponents of any policy of US imperialism. And we can move to the next slide now. At the head of all the US intelligence agencies, we can go to the next slide. At the head of all of the US intelligence agencies is Tulsi Gabbard, right? She actually ran for president back in 2020 as a Democrat, but has since revealed herself as a total political opportunist. Back before her loyalty was pledged to Trump's fascist agenda, she actually supported Edward Snowden and called him a brave whistleblower for exposing the US government's mass surveillance programs. And he was actually targeted by the Espionage Act. So she is now supportive of the same program that she once pushed a bill against, right? She is supportive of this authorization of targeted surveillance of foreign individuals without a warrant. And she's actually currently heading on a trip to the Indo-Pacific region to watch the US Armed Forces train there, right? The Indo-Pacific Command, as well as to attend a security conference with India to address strengthening AI-driven manufacturing and defense ties with the US. Her recent visit, along with Pete Hegseth, to the US-Mexico border underscores her efforts with the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI to increase surveillance efforts and militarization at the border. This opens the door for further prosecution of anyone who is daring to struggle for a future without fear of deportation, without fear of violent detention, imprisonment, and even any of us who dare to fight for a better future, a future free from exploitation. So, we just broke down all these cabinet picks and how their agencies and departments are carrying out this fascist attack to consolidate more power in the hands of the biggest monopoly capitalists, and how they plan to use state forces to repress people's resistance. But as ILPS, we know that this is a challenge that the people have faced before and will continue the struggle against until total liberation. So I'll now pass it to Nusha to walk us through, how we plan to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasper, and thank you, Sarah and Cody, for really thoroughly walking us through an understanding of this current fascist regime, the forces at play, and how they're actually directly impacting the people. So to kind of close out this discussion portion, the question is, why did we spend this time going through the Trump regime, going through his cabinet that he's built? This isn't a news roundup. We're not aiming to just present a bunch of facts. But really the point of all of this is to actually build a collective understanding of what all of this means and where things are going. And most importantly, really our goal is to change the situation, change these conditions. In order to do that, we need a strong analysis, and we need to have a firm grasp of the enemy that we're confronting and the tasks at hand. So this isn't just studying for study's sake, but really to understand the correct course of action needed to effectively fight back, and not just fight back against the attacks, but ultimately to actually defeat fascism. We need to know our enemy well, know the tactics that they use, and know the interests that they represent so that we can understand how we ought to organize under these conditions. So at the end of the day, in all, what is fascism? As it was very clearly outlined, fascism is a response of the ruling class to crisis and a direct attack against the people. But the crisis that we're facing didn't just come out of nowhere and is in fact a result of the current system itself. It's a result of imperialism, which constantly drives for more expansion, more exploitation, more economic and political dominance, and creates these exact crises. As folks mentioned earlier, doesn't need reminding, but imperialism remains the dominant political and economic system in the world today. And at the helm of the imperialist camp is really the US as the strongest, although declining imperialist state. And this decline is a very important part of it that we need to actually pay close attention to. But we should make no mistake about the role that that US imperialism plays. Under imperialism, we have a system where the monopoly capitalists control access to land, infrastructure, they dominate media and finance on a scale that is unprecedented in history. And more we see a situation where a smaller and smaller number of people control the vast majority of the world's production, the world's resources, and have increasing dominance in the world's economy. And of course, as the consolidation of economic and political power gets confined to smaller and smaller groups, they must continue to compete for economic and political dominance. And that has resulted in increasing militarist buildup and widespread violence against the people on a massive scale. all of these escalations are exactly what we're seeing under Trump and his regime as the representative of the most backwards and the most anti-people faction of the ruling class. And so today, the ruling class holds power over all aspects of society. And when confronted with a crisis, they pull the trigger on fascism. They abandon even the prior democratic pretenses and they resort to the most aggressive and most terroristic and violent rule in order to preserve and maintain their power. So, really, what I hope everyone takes away is that fascism is an emergency response of the ruling class to the self-made crisis of imperialism. And so, in order to defeat fascism, ultimately it's necessary to uproot and overthrow its source, which is imperialism. So, how are you going to do that? Right? In order to really respond to this fascist offensive, what's needed is to build a mass movement that is capable of defeating it. If we look all across the country and, in fact, all across the world, despite the very dire circumstances, we also are seeing a rising militancy, a rising unity, and a rising determination of the people in our own communities in fighting against these attacks. Over just the past year alone, we saw a growth and increasing revitalization of the anti-war movement. We've seen all different forms of a rising militant student movement across this country, increasing waves of workers going on strike, and elevating fights opposed to U.S. attacks against our homelands. So while we need to understand our enemy well, we also need to understand the people and the conditions of struggle and how we bring these together. What I hope is clear after today is that fascism isn't really just, it's not an abstract concept, but in fact, it's quite concrete and it expresses itself in the day-to-day lives of the people who are already suffering under the burden of imperialist crisis. And it shows itself in the everyday lives of the people. So for us in ILPS, we are an alliance of people's organizations. And so we firmly believe that the solution lies with the people, that the most effective way to really resolve these conditions is for the people to get more organized, right? The way to resolve the issue of fascism and imperialist crisis is to organize and to wage mass struggles and to fight all of these day-to-day expressions of fascism wherever they show themselves. And as Daniel mentioned at the beginning, for our part, ILPS US's contributions to this is by waging campaigns alongside the people, which directly address the crisis. And the two campaigns that were mentioned earlier are, for us, Defend People's Struggle and the People Over Profit campaign. Just to share a little bit, the Defend People's Struggle campaign aims to directly confront the fascist imperialist state, working to oppose the attacks against our communities and the means by which it implements these attacks, whether that's opposing the militarized state machinery, including ICE, the FBI, DHS, and the expansive police force, which is used to target migrants, working people, and people's organizations, or combating the constantly growing US military infrastructure and maneuvers used to expand US political and economic interests and repress those fighting for national liberation. We seek to bring these fights directly against the state and the military together. And so, I want to encourage all of you to join up with ILPS organizations who are working on the ground to fight all local expressions of these fascist attacks on the people and all expressions of the imperialist war machine. But of course, aside from the direct and open attacks by the state, as was mentioned and highlighted throughout, there are the impacts directly on the people due to the crisis, which has led to this fascism, right? We see this with the stagnant and depressing wages of workers, lack of access to affordable and quality housing, lack of access to affordable and quality education, and lack of access to affordable and quality healthcare. And of course, the heightening climate crisis due to the ongoing destruction of the environment driven by the imperialists' continual plunder of the land and the resources. And so this is why we've initiated also the People Over Profit campaign to really strengthen these fights on the ground. Oh no, go back to the last slide. No worries. To really strengthen these fights on the ground and link them up together and bring these struggles together in a coherent manner. And so the enemy that we're facing may seem quite strong, and in the short term, they have the upper hand. But we also need to take a look at the long view, and in the long view, they are actually quite weak and unstable. And most importantly, they represent the minority, right? This is a small fraction of society that has control over the vast wealth and political power in the world. So our task right now is to build up and wage militant mass struggle on the ground, organize more people, and weave together our various struggles and movements towards a common and cohesive struggle, directing its full strength squarely at our common enemy. And we see these campaigns, again, as one contribution, as one venue for us to take up these concrete fights, link up our different struggles together in that type of common action. And as we discussed, this is not a fight of the US alone, and so we need to firmly link the mass movement in this country with the international struggle around the world. So when the ruling class is lashing out, we know that in their instability, it is more and more necessary to decisively strike a blow, because this is also when the enemy is weakest, right? And this is the time to really boldly advance the people's struggle. So that's a little bit about our campaigns. And in a moment, when we close this portion, we'll actually be going into breakout discussions. And the purpose of those is to take all of the knowledge and the lessons that we learned so far today and apply them to our local conditions, whether you're in the US or abroad. How do we apply this analysis to understanding the terrain of struggle and understanding how we will wage these fights, how we will build up these campaigns, and how we will grow the mass movement, and really build the political strength of the people. But before we do those breakouts, aside from the bigger picture campaigns, which again, I invite you all to join us in waging side by side, I wanted to share a particular call to action that's coming up in a little while. So you see some of the calls to action, they're straightforward. Get involved in these campaigns, bring to them the issues that concern your community, the experience and the knowledge that you have, and the fights that you're waging, because we want to build a cohesive mass movement. But the particular call to action I wanted to share about is on May 1st. I'm sure many on this call are familiar, but May 1st is also commonly known as May Day, or International Workers' Day. And this is really a global day of action commemorating the struggle of workers and working people everywhere, really acknowledging the historic struggle of the workers, but also the ongoing fights in the here and now. And it is often marked by mass mobilizations of workers' organizations, trade unions, and working people. But this year in particular, especially in the current political situation, May Day falls in line with the 100 days of the Trump regime in office. And as you can see from the discussion today, fascism is not really merely a moral failing of a few evil individuals, but it serves the interests of the ruling class, of the capitalists. And so as such, fascism, while it attacks the people as a whole, it particularly directs the harshest blows against the working class. And for that reason, we need to understand the significance of building a strong mass movement among the workers at the core of the anti-imperialist and anti-fascist struggle, and understand the role that the working class plays in really leading the anti-fascist fight, because it strikes a blow at that root, right? On May Day and kind of around May Day, ILPS US is calling for all of our members to help lead actions, join contingents among other actions of workers' organizations, and we will be leading a number of different types of activities and mobilizations across the country. And so we invite you all to keep an eye out for these plans happening in your cities, and to join us in really making sure that May Day is a holiday of action, a holiday that represents and signifies the workers' struggle. And so to kind of close out today, really these calls to actions are moments of convergence where we can show the full strength and unity of the mass movement. But in order to give the full weight to these moments of convergence, what's most essential is, again, building up the mass campaigns which actually advance the interests of the people and equip the people with the tools of their own self-organization. So these mobilizations are only as strong as our campaigns, our struggles, and our fights. So with that, I'll close out this part of the webinar, and I'm going to pass it to Daniel to introduce the breakout groups before we split up.
Thanks, Nusha. Yeah, and thanks to everyone that spoke. We laid out our tasks at hand and what we're up against. We did want to take the last portion of this event for some group discussions. We don't want to just leave it at there. We want to hear from all of y'all. How are you taking up these fights in their community, where to go from here, so we can process some of the information and develop out these campaigns that can ultimately address the roots of these crises. So we've developed a couple different questions for folks to think about. The first one is, how do we see the fascist agenda playing out in our communities? Second one, what are people most angry about in your community? What actions are people taking? And then third, what steps can we take locally, nationally, and internationally to push for concrete changes? So we would love for folks to discuss any or all of these questions. And we've broken it down a bit by region. So we have a couple of different breakout groups that folks can start to join as soon as we wrap up here. For folks in the Seattle region, in NorCal, in Southern California, in the Baltimore DMV area, in the Northeast. We have a couple different regions that folks can join, but if you're not in one of those particular regions, there will be another separate breakout group for people within the US, but not in those regions. And if there are folks on joining us internationally, we would love to have you join there as well to discuss some of these questions. So we won't be gathering back around after these discussions, so folks can close out in your different breakouts when you feel the time is right. But we would love for people to take notes and share them back with the steering committee to be able to process how folks are taking up these fights locally and what issues are emerging. So with that, feel free to join a breakout group. There should be some facilitators assigned. Yeah, and please process some of these questions. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and I hope you all have a good night.